Hi, I'm delighted today to be with two of our graduating seniors, Jayson Paul, who is a physics and philosophy major, and Sam Rosenbloom, who's a political science major, and a visiting director, Scott Perry. And they're here to talk with me and present to you the extraordinary work they're doing this semester at Amherst. The idea for the production of a musical this semester came from Jayson Paul, and I'm going to ask Jayson to talk about the idea he had, the purpose of it, and what he hopes it is accomplishing.
So for me, the idea of the musical really came about last semester after everything that was happening on campus through Amherst Uprising. I seemed to get a sense that a lot of students felt in a way that they weren't finding the communities that they wanted to when they came to Amherst. As someone who has managed to find many different communities to be part of through my majors and through my extracurriculars, I felt particularly strongly about that and wanted to think about the question of community in a more active way. So when the idea of a musical came up, thanks to Mark Swanson, our orchestra conductor, who with Scott used to put on musicals, I really jumped on it. I loved the idea of creating some kind of project that could engage the students on the ground level, but more than that, that could engage students, faculty, staff, the whole college community in something that was distinctly Amherst. I really think the question of community always comes back to a question of shared experiences. And going to a school like Amherst, you'd think, oh, we're so small, like all our experiences are shared, but that's not always the case. And sometimes you have to, I think, go out of your way to create these kinds of environments where we can have these shared group experiences. Yeah.
Jayson, talk a little bit about the specific project you came up with.
Along with a friend and with the advice of Mark Swanson, we sat down and thought about what musical we could try to put on that would bring these questions of community and really work within the Amherst system. And immediately the thought that came to mind was Stephen Sondheim's really fabulous Into the Woods, which is a musical that works on so many different levels and is about so many different storylines crossing each other, conflicting with each other, merging together to produce a new unified story. It has, for those who don't know, Into the Woods is a collection of fairy tales that are kind of woven together with Sondheim's wonderful musical ability to create a new original story about these characters that we are so familiar with Cinderella, with Little Red Riding Hood, with the wolf. And the fact that a story could coalesce with all these disparate characters and all these disparate working parts together into a single event, into a single storyline, I felt mirrored in a lot of ways what Amherst is about, especially with our push for diversity and bringing in students from all different cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds. That Into the Woods was really a great choice in that sense. And also, it's really just a fun musical. Lots of students enjoyed it. When I floated the idea to a lot of my friends, and not even people I didn't know who really just wanted to put on a musical, they were like, oh, I know that musical, I know that music, I sing it all the time. And that was an important aspect as well, the excitement that we could get behind it. In the cast, I'm also part of the cast, and I play the narrator and the baker, who are two different characters, but I'm going to be switching off on different nights. So the baker's story is kind of the arc that carries the musical through. And in the end of the show, he sings a song with his father called No More, in which you see the way that their lives, which have kind of passed each other because his father left him when he was young and he had to grow up on his own. You see how that comes to a kind of resolution, a kind of understanding and accepting. How to start? All the woes, all the lies, the false hopes, the goodbyes, the reverses, all the wondering what even worse is still in store, all the witches, all the giants, no more. And with those lines, the baker finally comes to peace with himself and his relationship with his father and everything else that's been going on around them. So, I mean, it's a really fun role to play and a really fun song to sing.
And that was very courageous of you to sing on the spot. Thank you. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Scott, what did you think when you got the news in Columbus, Ohio, that our students wanted to put Into the Woods on as a musical?
It was very interesting because just a few months before I had been up to Amherst and we had done a presentation, a showing of our project that we had done 5 years earlier of Sweeney Todd. Back between 2005 and 2011, I would come up every year and we'd produce a musical during interterm. And that was one of the, I think, very successful examples of what that musical event could be. And Mark was intent to have a showing of that for some interested students on campus to sort of gauge interest and see if this was something we would explore, perhaps bringing back into fruition. And in fact, he and I had already had some discussion as to what repertoire would we want to look at. And indeed, we had already thought Into the Woods would be a great candidate for the exact reason that Jayson was saying. So it was very fortuitous then when I got the phone call from Mark saying, you know, Jayson Paul, who you met when you were up here, as well as Fernando Luis Lopez, who actually came as well to that showing, had shown up at his office and asked, what do you think about this, Mark? Can you give us some advice as to how to go about looking at Sondheim's Into the Woods? And I thought, how funny that it was sort of in the air, that we were already sort of discussing, in a sense, the same topic, the same sort of piece. And truly for those similar reasons, the idea in my mind that I had seen all around us in culture, in society, in our political environment, the sense of fracturing of communities and the sense of a feeling of disenfranchisement. And this was a piece that I thought would be very applicable to Amherst in particular, because it also is about a transition point in a community from self-orientation and self-goals to the idea of communal goals and communal needs, and how to bring those things together. The transition from youth to adulthood, the transition from naivete to knowledge, the transition from idealism to realism. And I felt like that's truly kind of encapsulates the college experience overall, but also very specifically about the issues that we're facing in our culture today. So it was wonderful to hear that, and I of course said I would love to be involved if at all possible, if the logistics can sort of work itself out around scheduling. And at that point, I think Mark then approached Jayson as well with this idea, and we started moving forward. And Jayson, of course, has put in countless hours on trying to work out all of the logistics to make this work in schedules for the students, as well as the sort of the funding and support from the campus, the community, and from the student government, which I think has really made this all possible.
Well, Sam, you're part of providing the music.
Music, yeah.
And what has it been like to rehearse and to put together this extraordinarily massive undertaking?
Yeah, so it's very different than sort of normal orchestra playing in many ways, because when you're playing in an orchestra, you only need to listen to the other orchestra members, and it's one thing to listen to the rest of your section and the rest of your family of instruments that you're playing in, and then, you know, to try to, for me, I'm a trumpet player, to hear what's going on, say, in the violins. But then when you have singers on top of that, and you need to sort of balance your sound, you need to hear sort of what they're saying, what their tempi are, what their rhythmic inflections are, and then you want to start following them, it becomes sort of a whole different project in a way. And, you know, I think one of the things about playing musical theater, and I did it in high school, and it was one of my favorite experiences there, is that there really is sort of this nexus of, on the one hand, the music, but then also sort of the lyrics and the poetry, right? It's not just sort of a purely musical, you know, sort of experience that doesn't have, say, this, you know, words that we love using at liberal arts colleges and all that stuff, but it has the words sort of set to music, and like that sort of combination for me, you know, that's why I love listening to musicals and I've listened to them my entire life. What's interesting in this particular show is that just like the cast, which is double cast, we are double casting much of the orchestra because it is a great time commitment for a lot of students. But you know, one of the other things we have is some of the most outstanding players on campus as part of this orchestra. And the other thing is that we also have great resources in the 5 colleges that when there are these parts that because we are a small campus we can't fill, we have wonderful resources from UMass and other campuses. And so it's a Amherst College event, and then also we're branching out a little bit too.
In the cast as well, we have some really incredible cast members who are parts of the 5 colleges, and also just general community members who took an interest in the project and wanted to be part of it. So while this is definitely an Amherst College project, it's not in that way limited to just us. And it's been a really great pleasure to meet all these new people from the community as well.
How did you get people in the community involved? How did they hear about it? How did they know?
Honestly, in a way, we didn't even need to try. We just said...
They came to you.
Yeah, we didn't even really... I don't think we really advertise the auditions in any grandiose kind of way. We just put up a couple flyers around the campus surreptitiously in the cover of darkness. And then we were getting responses from people at the other 5 colleges. I'm like, how did you even see that? And the first person actually to sign up for an audition was a community member who just happened to be on Facebook at the time when we started posting about the event. And she's like, oh, can I audition for this? And it was fortuitous that way. And she's in our cast now. If you come to the show, which I hope everyone will, you'll hear her sing the part of the baker's wife, and it's really remarkable that we were able to get all these people, not just from Amherst, even though the bulk of them come from Amherst and are really the students who are here and are part of musical life here, but also from the general community.
It's wonderful. I think our community, broadly speaking, and maybe our alumni especially, will be interested to hear that it's going to be staged in the hockey rink. Scott, that is quite an undertaking.
It's not a standard theatrical venue, obviously, and in fact, it's the first time I think I've ever attempted to stage something in a hockey rink, although I have done on a football field and I have done in a basketball court, but hockey rink is definitely poses certain challenges, absolutely new territory. The aspect of this really is about trying to find an appropriate space to have a large-scale gathering, number one, but number two, the idea of combining and bringing to the table different constituencies. And I think that that's part of it here. The idea of expanding the community, like Jayson mentioned, expanding those circles of community. There's the internal circle of the cast that then grows bigger with the orchestra, that then grows bigger with the support and the people who are involved in the logistic elements and the support of the finances and things of that nature. And then there's the audience itself that comes not only from the campus but then from the wider community. So it's this expanding rings of community circles actually that makes the doing of this in the rink kind of interesting. I've had so many meetings with people from athletics and facilities that are sort of saying, well, we've never done this before, but we're excited to try something new. We're excited to bring our resources to the table. The challenges do exist, and so it won't be like a traditional theatrical venue in any way, shape, or form. When audience comes in, we'll be performing in an intimate way on the formerly ice rink in a circular fashion, and sort of in the round, as it's called. So the intimacy will be, it's actually even more intimate perhaps than one would find in a normal theatrical venue.
Interesting. Scott, tell me what it's like to work with our students.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's always been a pleasure. In the many years that I've come up and participated in doing the annual musical, as well as there's been a couple of occasions I've come up to work as a visiting faculty member in music, to work on operas as well with the student body there in the music department. I've always found there to be not only the sincere intellectual curiosity, which is wonderful from the students, but the amazing talent that comes forth, not only from the singers, but from the players. Mark Swanson, I think, his coming to campus and developing the orchestral program here has really become a draw and raised a bar on those musicianship skills that have been, I think, integral to making projects like this really work. And I've constantly been surprised by the things and that people can bring to the table from different disciplines, different walks of life. When you have, for instance, in our cast, a couple of rugby players, one of which has never sung before or been on the stage, and suddenly they're performing a leading role and singing solo numbers and duets and enjoying that process, but bringing a certain style and point of view to that production that no one else could because of that individual background. The students here at Amherst College are so multifaceted and have such widely diverse interests and background, and it makes that process of getting to know them and getting to bring those interests into a common goal all the more rich in the diversity.
I was thinking about the expanding communities, and it made me think about the symposium yesterday. So there was a symposium that you all organized, I assume, at the Center for Humanistic Inquiry. And we had a panel that included Scott, Mark Swanson, and also 3 faculty members. And I was fortunate to be able to attend. Some of the things that were said stuck with me throughout the evening and the night. I'm thinking about Jeffrey Sanborn talking about leave taking when he was asked, or when the entire panel was asked, what it meant to go into the woods. And he talked about leave taking as a state of being as opposed to a one and done experience. Or David Schneider, who from the audience said it was about lostness as a state of being. What interested you all most about the panel discussion yesterday?
The idea of the panel was that we really wanted faculty to have an opportunity to speak on the academic level about what the themes and ideas we'll be working in the production are. And I think it was a really great success because the faculty were all engaged, they were all familiar with the show, they were all, it seemed, very happy to be there and to get to listen to the numbers performed. For me though, I think the most interesting part of the discussion was just what you were talking about, what it means to go into the woods. It's somewhat ironic, and I think Professor Sanborn might have said this, that the woods aren't really featured. I know Mark and Scott have been saying this for months as well, but the woods aren't really what the musical is about. You're actually just talking about what happens in the woods and not so much, oh, look, the trees or look, the flowers. You're looking at what changes about the characters as they go through this experience. And in a way that I'm sure Sam can talk about, Amherst changes us in a similar way. As students, we come in, and when we're at Amherst, we're metaphorically in the woods and close to the woods as well. Since we're, it's actually that parallel for me, and thinking about how the experiences of these characters and their ability to form a community in the end, in the face of really terrible danger, mirrors, or maybe in some ways doesn't mirror, our Amherst experience, and thinking about really what kind of communities can be formed. I think one of the professors said that yes, they formed a community when they went through the woods, but it's not necessarily the kind of community we'd want to form. It's the community formed because of danger and fear and needing to survive, which in some ways is, I think, if we really think about students as people who have all these complex needs, needs to thrive, to be social, to be feel as though they belong, while we're not thinking about people literally dying, there's an important need that the Amherst College community needs to fill. And I think that projects like this musical that bring people together, even if at times it's to slay a giant, are really important.
By the way, the giant, I hope you have someone good to play that role.
I think when we started this whole project, and Jayson, Mark, and I were down on the bottom floor of Arms Music Building, and I said, you know, I think I know exactly who should play the giant, and I said none other than President Martin, than Biddy, would be perfect in the role, and it was wonderful to hear you record the part. We're definitely going to be looking forward to hearing you in the rink, booming across the whole space. So
we needed a giant figure on campus to play the giant, so
sure you did. Sure you did.
Well, what's one of the interesting things, just returning to the discussion of the panel, it is very ironic that Amherst College, of all places, chose a musical by Stephen Sondheim to revive its annual musical, and the reason is that Sondheim is an alumnus of the class of 1950 at Williams. And and you know, it's very interesting because you know, Sondheim, even before he went to Williams, he was from the Upper West Side of New York City. His sort of childhood father, in some ways musical father, was Oscar Hammerstein, the great lyricist, perhaps one of the greatest lyricists of the first half of the 20th century. And I think one of the things you see about Sondheim in all his musicals, but also in terms of who he was in college, I've read a little bit about him, is that he was a true student of the liberal arts. He went into Williams thinking he was going to major in mathematics. He then thought he was going to do English, but he called that a fallback major. Which is interesting. But then he decided, I think that maybe music is the right place to go. And he took a course with Robert Barrow, who was teaching there. And one of the things he writes about is how being in that introductory music course that he took sort of let him understand more the art of music, not only sort of the technical qualities of it, but the true sort of art of thinking and composing music. And one of the things I think you see in Sondheim's work, and this is one of the things that for me was most important about this panel, is sort of that very close connection between, on the one hand, what you're trying to articulate through words and through the actual lyrics of the show, and boy are there a lot of lyrics in this show, and then the musical representations of those ideas. And so one of the things Professor Sanborn spoke about is how Jack, at the end of his number on the giant, is talking about how the giant, they're these big, tall, terrible, awesome, scary giants, and how there's a certain rhythm almost of all those adjectives where you just want to get across the adjectival quality of the giant, how you almost can't with words alone express exactly what the giant is. As the witch says, the giant is huge. The giant is, it seems to be more than what can be just expressed with mere words. I think that one of the things that Sondheim embodies in terms of his musical writing is that sort of understanding that we can't just have words alone, that there are other questions, say about community, say about artistic expression, that need the words, need the lyrics, need the plot, but extend well beyond it. And that's where you start to hear him doing these fascinating things where he'll take the theme he initially uses for The Witch, this sort of really scary theme that he sets on top of these, the chords that are known as the psycho chords, because he took them right from Bernard Herrmann in Alfred Hitchcock's famous film. And he takes that theme and then he turns it into the theme that represents the beans, and the beans we think growth. So on the one hand, we have this sort of scary, creepy theme introducing the witch early in the show, and then we have it turning into this theme that represents sort of the growth, but possibly the scary growth. I mean, Jack's beanstalk is huge. And so, for me, that, that whole discussion that Mark and Scott and Professor Sanborn as well were having about that sort of nexus of speech and then the music and other aspects of it was very, very important in terms of understanding, I think, why Sondheim and why this show is uniquely suited maybe for a liberal arts college.
And if I can add on to that, actually, I'm a professor of lyric theater at The Ohio State University, as well as doing a long stint and run at New York City Opera, where I live in New York. There is something about the idea of lyric theater, of the idea of text and music coming together, that actually forms a third rail, to tell you the truth. What I see is the lyric aspect is definable, is objective, and then you have the musical aspect, which is very subjective to the person, and it hits us in a more emotive way rather than an intellectual way per se. In the combining of the objective and subjective, you find a sense of subtext, this thing that is below text, that is somehow emotional as well as intellectual simultaneously. And that sort of third element, which when we combine lyric and music, actually forms a different kind of art form altogether. It is neither speech nor music, it is speech music. It is a wedding of these things together, and you can't quite even pull them apart. When you say a lyric on its own, it has a certain quality, but it certainly has a more intellectual quality. And when you hear music on its own, maybe we're moved by it, but we don't have a concrete representation of what that means. You put them together and suddenly there's a combining that is so holistic in a way that forms its own art form, which is why I think the musical theater, the lyric theater, opera, these sorts of things that combine art forms, the multidisciplinary aspect here, is truly something that I think is worthy of further discussion, worthy of further investment.
And I think to add to that as well, the elements of music that, and I guess also lyric work that's, and storytelling work that's about enjoyment and pleasure, but then on one hand, and then also about serious themes and deep ideas, that musical theater, because it works on those two levels in concert, adds a whole other dimension of how you can talk about, I mean, Into the Woods is hilarious sometimes, and then sometimes it's also really dark and heavy and serious. And the fact that you can have all these things working in concert, I think it's remarkable, and something that musical theater does really, really well.
Yeah, I was going to say this, I'm thinking about Bernadette Peters in the Broadway version, who even when she's only speaking, not singing, without music, it could be singing. It sounds as though she's singing.
Indeed.
One of the things for me is that witnessing a Broadway musical and being in that experience is actually in some ways very similar to being in a liberal arts classroom at its best. And the reason is that the liberal arts classroom is not just based on the content of the material that's being talked about, but is actually, to use one of the things Professor Sanborn says, is a sort of co-created experience among the students and the faculty member in the classroom. And that over the course of, say, the hour and 20 minutes or 2.5 hours of a class, what's going to happen is there's not just going to be content discussed, there's going to be a certain sort of aesthetic relationship between what's going on, between what everyone is saying. And so this, will maybe extend to things such as whether people are making references to new ideas that maybe weren't in the initial reading. We were talking recently in actually Professor Sanborn's course about John Cage, a sort of fascinating composer of the 20th century, and we were relating it to Virginia Woolf. And that only came into existence because I happened to, in a Moodle post before class, make a brief minor reference, and then we sort of talked about that for 2 minutes. And sort of, one of the things I think in theater is it's also a co-created experience, because just think, in terms of maybe comedy is the easiest way of seeing this, that if you're trying to tell a joke in a musical, when you tell the joke and you get to see how the audience reacts, you get a sense of, what type of audience is this? And then actors can, and musicians as well, can play to that type of audience. If it happens to be a very funny night, maybe you're going to play things in a different way than you might in other situations.
Well, there's some extraordinary individuals who are going to make up this night or this set of nights, and I can't wait to see the production. Thank you all very much for agreeing to talk about it and for making it happen. We all appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.